Journey IFC strives to create safe spaces to worship God. Know that you are welcome just as you are, regardless of religious background or lack thereof, skin color, political affiliation, sexuality, age, culture, or any other label you own or society throws on you. You are welcomed and celebrated here just as you are.
I'm Albert, or Ace. I'll answer to either one. So. Our reading comes from the period in Israel's history when they were freed from slavery in Egypt. The Israelites had been wandering in the desert for 40 years, and they were about to reach the promised land. At that time, the Moabites were living in the land, and the Moabite king Balak feared Israel's power. King Balak sent for a renowned prophet named Balaam, saying, "Come now, curse these people for me, since they are stronger than I. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land, for I know that whomever you bless is blessed, and whomever you curse is cursed." King Balak offered Balaam great riches to come and curse the Israelites. However, the prophet Balaam ran into some roadblocks. God told Balaam not to go unless Balaam would follow God's orders, and God's orders only. So Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the officials of Moab. God's anger was kindled because he was going, and the angel of God took a stand in the road as Balaam's adversary. Now, Balaam was riding on the donkey, and his two servants were with him. The donkey saw the angel standing in the road with a drawn sword in their hand, so the donkey turned off the road and went into the field. Balaam struck the donkey, turned it back into the road. Then the angel stood in a narrow path between the vineyards, with a wall on either side. When the donkey saw the angel, it scraped against the wall and scraped Balaam's foot against the wall, so he struck it again. Then the angel went ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel, it lay down under Balaam, and Balaam's anger was kindled, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Then God opened the mouth of the donkey, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you have made a fool of me. I wish I had a sword in my hand. I would kill you right now." But the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I been in the habit of treating you this way?" And he said, "No." Then God opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel standing in the road with their sword drawn in their hand, and he bowed down, falling on his face. The angel said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? I have come out as an adversary because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If it had not turned away from me, surely just now I would have killed you and let it live." Then Balaam said to the angel, "I sinned, for I did not know that you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now therefore, if it is displeasing to you, I will return home." The angel said to Balaam, "Go with the men, and speak only what I tell you to speak."
So our summer of sin is heating up. It's heating up outside too, that's for sure. We're into the 3rd week of the 7 Deadly Sin series, and we started with pride, and we went to envy, and now we're moving on to wrath, which is a fun one. And wrath is an interesting deadly sin because it is the only deadly sin that Scripture attributes to God. Isn't that interesting? It's the only one that is attributed to God. We hear about God's wrath being brought down on many nations, and the threat of God's wrath seems to be looming if we fall into sin, whatever that is. Many have heard this word wrath in a lot of church circles. Heck, we probably have heard this, at pride festivals or on street corners as people shout at us, calling us wicked, saying God's wrath is coming down on us. So as we sit with this, I'm thinking, what is wrath? And why is it that God can be wrathful, but it's a deadly sin if we do it? I think an important distinction is to be made here. When we hear wrath, many of us immediately associate it with anger, almost synonymously. However, while wrath comes out of anger, wrath seems to be a heightened sense of anger. We may get mad from time to time, but wrath is much more than that, much more intense than that. Wrath is anger that seeks retaliation of some sort. And not just an eye for an eye kind of retaliation, it's more like vengeance. And this is a vengeance that is not in line with what is just or equitable. Because really, anger can lead us to fight for justice, but wrath seems to throw justice out the window and just wants blood. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines wrath as anger that is either directed against an innocent person, anger that is unduly strong or long-lasting, or anger that desires excessive punishment. So basically, wrath is what happens when our anger gets out of control. Dorothy Sayers, in the introduction to her novel Purgatory, describes wrath as, and I wrote this, love of justice, perverted to revenge and spite. I'm going to say that again. Love of justice has been perverted to revenge and spite. I think this is such a fascinating way to define wrath. Wrath is something that starts out with a hope for justice in mind, but it gets mixed up into the emotions and loses track of what is fair. The story we read this morning, while long, is such a fun one for me to hear. I think it's a little silly. The story of Balaam and his talking donkey is one of those stories in the Bible that makes you go, what the heck is this Bible all about? Why is there a talking donkey in this story? And I'd say this story is one of the favorites of pastors' types because it gives us an excuse to say the word ass in the front of a bunch of people. And that's always a fun time, so I might say it a couple times just for the heck of it. But beyond that, the story is humorous, at least at first glance. But behind that humor lies some great wisdom, I believe. The story goes that there was a prophet named Balaam, and he's called upon by the king of Moab to help the Moabites defeat the Israelites. The Israelites had been wandering in the desert for about 40 years at this time after fleeing enslavement in Egypt. And they were promised by God a land that was flowing with milk and honey. And they have not gotten there yet, but they're almost there, at least they think. But the problem is that that land was already occupied by people. The Moabites were neighbors to where the Israelites had set up camp, and they feared the power of the Israelites because they had heard what the Israelites' God could do for them, and they heard how successful the Israelites were against other nations. So Balak, or however you want to say it, the king of Moab, called for the prophet Balaam to come and place a curse on the Israelites. Balaam was a famous guy at this time, a famous prophet, and he had already helped his people win another battle with his seemingly supernatural prophetic abilities of his. So Balaam was the obvious choice to bring in to curse the enemy. But the problem was that Balaam was a servant of God. Some commentaries and ancient Jewish scholars call Balaam a wicked prophet, which I don't think is really fair. Because really, all along, he's just a man who's doing his best, trying to follow what he thinks God is telling him to do. And even through this entire scenario, Balaam continues to follow God's direction like a prophet should, ideally. Or, I would say, follow God's misdirection in some circumstances. Balaam is told by God not to go help Balak and the Moabites. Balaam has several back and forth scenes that I didn't include in the reading because it was long enough as it is, where he puts off going and has all these excuses, and eventually God tells him that he can go as long as he listens to God's word only. And so Balaam decides to go, and he gets up in the morning and he rides his donkey towards Moab. But something a little strange happens with said donkey. His trusty steed begins cowering at seemingly nothing. The donkey won't go where Balaam leads him to go, and this angers Balaam, and Balaam gets so frustrated that he eventually hits the poor donkey. Little did Balaam know, but the way to Moab had been blocked by an angel of God. And the donkey seemed to recognize or sense this angelic presence even when Balaam could not himself. So 3 times the donkey fears going towards the angel and cowers back, even gets under Balaam, which I think is just a cute image. I just can see it in my head. Leading Balaam to get knocked into some rocks and hurt his foot at one point, and Balaam is just getting more and more frustrated. And Balaam gets so angry that he hits this donkey 3 different times. But then my favorite part of the story happens. The donkey is given a chance to speak back. And he says, "What the heck, dude? What have I done to you to deserve this sort of beating? Haven't I been reliable to you and a dear donkey to you all this time? How can you be so bold to strike me 3 times while I'm doing my best to get you from point A to point B? And you know what? I'm protecting you from an angel who's trying to stop your passage." The donkey gets a voice and talks back. He doesn't say all that. I might have added a little bit of that. But I like to think he might have said something like that. But as the donkey talks back, Balaam seems to be put in his place. And he sees the error in his undue wrath at this donkey. The angel finally appears before Balaam and also berates Balaam, saying that he would have killed him and kept the donkey alive, which I thought was such a good line, if the donkey hadn't turned away. The reason Balaam was sent to Moab was to curse the Israelites. Balaam was being used as a tool for someone else's wrath. Balaam was not wrathful towards the Israelites himself per se. It was just that he was on his way to do his job. And then he got caught up in a bit of wrath of his own. It's as if this experience with wrath towards this donkey was a bit of a microcosm of what was going on around Balaam. Maybe him striking his donkey 3 times wasn't even about the donkey or hitting his foot or any of that. Maybe it was about something else. As I read the story, I was reminded of a moment in Israel. I went to Israel in January, and one day we spent a day in a really divisive region near the West Bank of Israel in a town called Hebron. We were warned beforehand that this part of the trip would be intense. And we would see the tension while visiting this region, but the rabbi on the trip wouldn't tell us what that would look like, and my anxiety was high. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was going to be right in front of our eyes in a way I never knew could be, and I was terrified. I didn't know what to expect in that moment. And as we drove into Hebron to see some old religious site, they're all old religious sites, that is highly fought over, they're all highly fought over, and happens to be the site of a large mass murder, we passed guards with machine guns who pointed them at our bulletproof bus. When we got there, we parked and got out, and I was like shaking. I didn't know what was going to happen, and my stomach was all in knots. I was safe, I just didn't feel it. But around that time, a Palestinian man with his arm in a sling, clearly hurt from something, came up to us and was trying to sell us some bracelets. And I have to say, he was a little annoying. He was kind of pestering us. But we did the thing that we all do as we're at stoplights and stuff. We kind of just shrugged him off, hoping, he would leave if we didn't, give him any attention. But our bus driver that day got upset with this Palestinian man and had a different response. This bus driver's anger progressed further and further and turned into what I would call wrath. And our Israeli bus driver, ended up getting into a physical altercation with this Palestinian man who was just trying to sell some bracelets and make some money. At one point, we even saw the bus driver chase the man off with a brick in hand and a threat on his tongue, waving a fist in his face. Anger in that moment had become wrath. This Palestinian man hadn't really done much, but it upset this bus driver. And it struck some kind of nerve that was much deeper than that particular moment called for. We were told we were going to see the division of Israel and Palestine firsthand, and it was happening right there in that one simple encounter. But that one interaction was much more than that one interaction. In that encounter, the weight of the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict was thrust onto the shoulders of these 2 men, archetypes of sorts. And that moment is one that I think I'm going to struggle to forget. Maybe I don't want to forget it, actually. But in that moment, I saw how what was happening on the large scale was affecting everything, not just the big government stuff, but it was affecting the small day-to-day stuff. And I think that's what's deadly about, this sin of wrath. Wrath is this contagious and systemic disease that makes us forget all about justice and what is a reasonable response. And I think the bus driver and Balaam both experienced this. They both were brought into a divided, intense situation and were faced with their own struggles. Seemingly small-scale stuff, but they reacted in large-scale ways. It was a microcosm of the tension everyone was feeling all around us. The real reason I love this story of Balaam and the donkey, beyond the getting to say ass thing, is that the powerless character gets a voice. This does not always happen, especially in Scripture. Typically, we're given the winner's report, and we are told the story from a single perspective, the one with the most prestige or authority or privilege. But in our story today, a poor little beaten donkey who's beaten 3 times is allowed to talk back and say, hey, this is not okay. You cannot treat me this way. The virtue often associated with wrath, almost as a prescribed antidote in some cases, is patience, which I struggle with. The ability to sit in the discomfort of a situation without letting the situation get out of hand. Patience. But as this story of Balaam reminds us, it can be easier to be patient when we know the other side of the story, when the lesser power gets a voice too. When those we are being aggressive against get a voice, they can remind us that how we are reacting is not okay, maybe. And I think sometimes we need that reminder. Because there are going to be times when we get angry, a lot of times, in fact. Jesus did it. He was flipping tables. He was angry all the time. There are going to be times when our patience and anger are tested, and we may dip into the deadly waters of wrath. We may start out with some righteous anger that hopes for positive changes, that is fighting for the weak among us, that is pushing us towards corrective actions, only to lose track of ourselves and our emotions, taking our anger to vengeful and maybe even aggressive places that can endanger us and those we seek to harm. And I think this is what can kill the soul. I think it can actually kill many souls if we're not careful. But I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier. Wrath is the only deadly sin that is associated with God. When we put it into the story of a donkey or a Palestinian man, we see that wrath is dangerous. But why do we praise a God of wrath? Or is our God really a God of wrath after all? For God to be wrathful would suggest that God could sin, that God could go against God's will and harm God's creation out of spite or revenge. Many people preach that kind of God, and I'll be honest, that is not a God I want to follow. Instead, I want to believe in a God of patience who teaches us to listen to the voice of the weak and the less powerful. I want to believe in a God who encourages us to hear both sides, who will be in true relationship with us, which requires conversation, a back and forth, some give and take, some change in both parties, God and us. I want a God that is held to the same standards as us. And I think that is why this story may have been included in the Scriptures in the first place. It's a reminder of the God of blessings and not of a God of curses. The changes we see in this man, this stranger, this prophet, Balaam, from anger to blessing may be a microcosm of the grace that God is extending to all of us. Just like wrath was the microcosm of that day in Hebron, and in that moment when Balaam strikes his beloved talking donkey, maybe blessings can be a microcosm too. I think of that clip from Godspell. That's one that my dad refers to a lot. I love that clip. Not because of what's written. It's the acting that goes with it, kind of like we were pointing out. Because in the thing, he splits the sheep and the goats, and some get to go to heaven, and some get the wrathful God, the vengeful God that are sent to eternal damnation in hell. But then at the end, Jesus comes back with his big afro and Superman shirt, and he waves them up and he says, "Come on." And I think that's how I see God. I don't see God in the wrath and the anger. I see God in this character who's willing to wave them up, even though they've been set apart as doing something wrong. I think Balaam's story ends in a really cool and wonderful way. Balaam finally makes it to the Moabites, and he's tasked with cursing the Israelites, but God has other plans. The prophet Balaam is told by God to offer a blessing 3 separate times, and they're not just simple blessings, they're profound, over-the-top blessings over the so-called enemy. It goes from curse to blessing, a microcosm of grace. I think wrath is the easy way out. And I think we are called to much more than that. I think we and God have been equipped with more love and more patience and more grace than what wrath calls for. And that's not to say that it's going to be easy to avoid wrath altogether, because when the world gets tough, when political and social tensions rise, when we become a microcosm of what is going on around us, we may be primed to react in negative ways. We may seek undue and unjust retaliation. But I think we can learn from Balaam and his ass. One last one in there, I had to. When things get hard and we find ourselves in angry and heated situations, we can slow down, be patient, and try to listen to the other side of the story. We can remember that God is not a God of wrath, but a God of blessings. And we can take what was meant to be a curse and make it into not just a blessing, but a 3-fold blessing. And in that, we can become microcosms of God's grace as well. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.
So this is an older song, a hymn that you might know. I don't love the lyrics to it, but I kept the classic hymn lyrics here. But I think the part that I want to focus on is the chorus where it says, "It is well with my soul." I think you know the song, maybe. And I think it reminds us that no matter what happens in life, angers, the good, the bad, there's something in us that can stay consistent and true, that it can be well in our souls. And that is our prayer as we sing this together.
Well, here we come to another end on the way to sin. Or not. You know, it's interesting. In anger and wrath, parts of donkeys have been used to what? Didn't God use the jawbone of an ass through Samson? Wrath and anger there. But also God can use a donkey. But this is the real lesson we should learn from this, really, not about so much wrath, because wrath harms the soul. Anger can cleanse the soul. So have good holy anger about injustices to people of God's community. We're all creations of God. It's okay to be angry, but wrath only clouds your vision. Put on the filtering glasses of God. See past the wrath and become the mouthpiece of God. And if you fail to do that, all the story tells us that if you won't speak out, God can use the dog next door if he was so inclined. So go in peace, see through the wrath, be good to one another, and remember the glory of God is nothing but the humanity fully alive.
Amen.